Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a name spoken in whispers among the halls of the Imperium's greatest warriors, a name that carries with it the weight of impossible deeds and the shadow of something ancient and unknowable. It belongs to a being who has walked through the valley of death not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, and each time emerged stronger than before, more terrible, more powerful, and perhaps, if the darkest rumors are to be believed, less human than the time before. His name is Mephiston, the Lord of Death, Chief Librarian of the Blood Angels chapter. And he is, by nearly every measure that matters, the most powerful space marine to have ever drawn breath in the 41st millennium. But that title does not come easily, and it does not come without cost. Because the story of Mephiston is not simply a story about power. It is a story about what happens when an unstoppable will meets an immovable curse. It is a story about a man who was buried alive beneath the rubble of a dying world, who lay trapped for 7 days and 7 nights, wrestling with a madness that had claimed every single soul who came before him, and who emerged from that darkness as something the galaxy had never seen before. Something that even his own brothers, the sons of Sanguinius themselves, are not entirely sure they can trust. To understand Mephiston, we need to understand what made him, and that means going back, way back. Back to the golden age of the Imperium, to the time of the Great Crusade, to the creation of the Space Marine legions, and to the story of the most beautiful and most tragic of all the Emperor's sons. Because Mephiston's story does not begin with Mephiston, as it begins, as all Blood Angels stories do, with the great angel himself. It begins with Sanguinius. So settle in, get comfortable, because this is going to be a long one. And by the time we are finished, you will understand why Mephiston is not just the most powerful space marine alive. You will understand why he might also be the most dangerous. And you will understand why even in a galaxy drowning in war and horror, the Lord of Death stands apart as something utterly singular, something that should not exist. Something that, depending on who you ask, might be the Imperium's greatest hope or its most devastating curse. Let us begin. The Emperor of mankind, that immortal and incomprehensible being who sits upon the golden throne on distant Terra, created 20 sons to help him conquer the galaxy. These were the Primarchs, a genetically engineered demigods of extraordinary power and ability, each one designed to lead a legion of space marines in the grand campaign to unite all of humanity under a single banner. They were scattered across the stars as infants by the machinations of the chaos gods, hurled through the warp to distant worlds where they would grow and develop in isolation before being reunited with their father and their genetic sons. Of all these Primarchs, none was quite like Sanguinius. Found on the irradiated desert moon of Baal Secundus, the infant Primarch bore a mutation that set him apart from all his brothers. Great feathered wings grew from his back, white as driven snow, spreading wide enough to carry him through the thin atmosphere of his adopted homeworld. He was beautiful in a way that transcended ordinary human aesthetics. Yet his face was angelic in the most literal sense of the word, bearing features so perfect and so radiant that those who looked upon him often wept, not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming sensation of being in the presence of something divine. But beauty was only the surface of what Sanguinius was. Beneath that angelic exterior burned a warrior's heart of staggering ferocity. He united the radiation-scarred tribes of Baal under his banner, leading them against the twisted mutants that haunted the desert wastes. He was a leader of extraordinary charisma, a diplomat of rare sensitivity, and a fighter of devastating skill. When the Emperor finally found him, Sanguinius knelt without hesitation, but not before demanding something remarkable. He made the Emperor swear an oath to leave the people of Baal in peace. He was the only Primarch ever known to have placed a condition on his allegiance, and the Emperor, recognizing the nobility of the request, agreed. Sanguinius took command of the 9th Legion, which became the Blood Angels, and together they swept across the galaxy as part of the Great Crusade. World after world fell before them. The Blood Angels fought with a grace and fury that distinguished them from all other legions. Where others relied on brute force or cold precision, the sons of Sanguinius combined artistry with violence in a way that was both beautiful and horrifying to behold. They were artists and scholars as much as they were warriors, crafting works of sublime beauty between campaigns of terrible destruction. And at their head flew Sanguinius, wings spread wide against alien skies, the living embodiment of everything the Imperium aspired to be. Many among the Imperium's ruling class believed that Sanguinius was the finest of all the Primarchs. Even his brothers acknowledged it. Horus himself, the War Master, the first among equals, considered Sanguinius his closest friend and his greatest peer. There were whispers that if the Emperor had chosen differently, if he had named a different son as War Master, it would have been the Great Angel. But hidden beneath the splendor of the Blood Angels was a dark and terrible secret, a flaw in the very gene seed that made them what they were, a hunger that lurked in the blood of every son of Sanguinius, waiting for the moment of weakness when it could surge to the surface and consume them entirely. The Red Thirst, they called it. An overwhelming desire for blood that could turn even the most disciplined warrior into a feral predator, driven by urges that no amount of training or conditioning could fully suppress. Sanguinius knew about this flaw. He struggled with it constantly, fighting a private war against his own nature even as he led his sons across the stars. And his greatest fear was that the Emperor would discover this defect and consider the Blood Angels too dangerous to exist. So he kept the secret close, sharing it only with his most trusted confidants, and prayed that a cure could be found before the truth came to light. It was Horus who discovered the flaw while on joint campaign with the Blood Angels, and it was Horus who chose to keep the secret from the Emperor. An act of brotherhood that would later take on a far darker significance when the War Master turned traitor and plunged the Imperium into the most devastating civil war in human history. But that betrayal and the tragedy it would bring were still years in the future. For now, the Blood Angels continued their crusade across the stars, their angelic Primarch leading them to glory after glory, the dark secret of their blood kept carefully hidden from the eyes of those who might destroy them for it. This is the foundation upon which everything else is built. This is the legacy that Mephiston inherited, the beauty and the horror, the grace and the madness, the angel and the monster, locked together in an eternal struggle within the blood of every single son of Sanguinius. And to understand Mephiston, to truly grasp the magnitude of what he accomplished and the price he paid for it, we need to understand exactly what that legacy became after Sanguinius fell. Because the fall of Sanguinius changed everything, it is the defining moment of Blood Angel's history, the wound that has never healed, the death that echoes through 10,000 years of warfare and suffering, felt as keenly by the sons of Sanguinius today as it was by those who witnessed it firsthand in the final hours of the heresy, the Horus heresy, the great betrayal, when Horus Lupercal, first among the Primarchs, War Master of the Imperium, turned his back on the Emperor and swore himself to the ruinous powers of chaos. Half the legions followed him into damnation, and the galaxy was plunged into a war of such ferocity that entire star systems were reduced to ash. Brother fought brother. Legions that had once stood shoulder to shoulder on 100 battlefields now turned their weapons on each other with a hatred born of betrayal and corrupted brotherhood. Sanguinius stood with the Emperor. Of course he did. The Great Angel was loyal to his core, and no temptation the dark gods could offer was sufficient to sway him from his duty. But loyalty came at a terrible price. Before the Siege of Terror, the Blood Angels were lured into a trap at the Cygnus cluster, where the demonic forces of chaos attempted to corrupt them utterly. It was here that Sanguinius first encountered Kabanda, a bloodthirster of Khorne, a towering demon of violence and murder who would become the eternal nemesis of the Blood Angels. The battle at Cygnus Prime was devastating. Kabanda struck Sanguinius a blow so powerful that it shattered his legs and sent the Primarch crashing to the ground. But worse than the physical injury was the psychic shockwave that rippled through the Blood Angels when their father fell. The entire legion was consumed by a terrible fury, a berserker rage that stripped away all reason and discipline, leaving only an insatiable hunger for violence and blood. They tore into the demon horde with a savagery that even the forces of chaos had not anticipated, destroying everything in their path until the planet was scoured clean. When the rage finally subsided, the Blood Angels were left shaken and horrified by what they had done. The red thirst had always been their secret shame, but this was something different, something worse. This was a fury that went beyond mere hunger. This was madness, pure and absolute, a loss of self so complete that those caught in its grip ceased to exist as individuals and became nothing more than instruments of destruction. It was a preview of what was to come, a warning of the curse that would soon define the Blood Angels for the rest of eternity. The Siege of Terror was the final confrontation between the forces of the Emperor and the traitor legions of Horus. The loyalist forces defending the imperial palace were besieged by the combined might of the traitor legions and their demonic allies. The fighting was beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Entire sections of the palace were reduced to rubble. Millions died in battles that raged across the surface of humanity's homeworld. Sanguinius fought at the forefront of the defense. Wounded and exhausted from the battles at Cygnus Prime and the subsequent campaigns, the great angel nevertheless refused to yield. When the outer walls fell, he rallied the defenders. When the inner fortifications were breached, he led the counterattack. And when Horus lowered the shields of his flagship, the vengeful spirit, in a final gambit to draw the Emperor into a trap, Sanguinius was at his father's side when the teleport beams carried them aboard the traitor vessel. But they became separated in the twisted corridors of the corrupted ship. Sanguinius found himself alone, facing the full, terrible power of Horus, who by this point had been elevated to something approaching godhood by the dark powers he served. The Primarch of the Blood Angels knew he was walking to his death, yet he had foreseen it in visions that had haunted him for years. He knew that Horus was too powerful to defeat, that the dark gods had poured their collective might into their chosen champion, that no mortal or transhuman being could stand against such concentrated evil and survive. But Sanguinius faced his brother anyway, not because he believed he could win, but because it was the right thing to do, because someone had to stand between Horus and the Emperor, even if only for a moment. Because that was who Sanguinius was, the angel who chose to sacrifice himself so that others might live. The duel was brief and devastating. Horus, swollen with the power of 4 chaos gods, was simply too much for even the great angel. He struck Sanguinius down, killing the most beloved of the Emperor's sons in one final act of betrayal that severed the last thread of brotherhood between them. But Sanguinius did not die in vain. The legends say that in his final moments, he managed to create a small crack in Horus's armor. A tiny weakness, almost insignificant. But it was through that crack that the Emperor was later able to deliver the killing blow that ended the heresy and cast Horus down forever. The death of Sanguinius saved the Imperium, but it damned his sons, because when the great angel fell, something broke within every single blood angel across the galaxy. A psychic shockwave of such magnitude that it fundamentally altered the gene seed of the entire legion. The memory of Sanguinius's death, the pain and the horror and the desperate fury of his final moments, it was imprinted into the very genetic code of his sons, burned into their blood like a brand, passed down from generation to generation through the sacred rituals of gene seed implantation, growing stronger with each passing century until it became an inescapable part of what it meant to be a blood angel. This is the Black Rage, and this is where Mephiston's story truly begins, because the Black Rage is the curse that has defined the blood angels for 10,000 years. It is the madness that no warrior can resist, the doom that awaits every son of Sanguinius, the shadow that hangs over even the chapter's greatest triumphs. And it is the prison from which no blood angel has ever escaped. Until Mephiston. The Black Rage is not simply anger or aggression. It is a complete psychological collapse. A shattering of identity so absolute that the afflicted warrior ceases to exist as himself and becomes, in his own mind, sanguineous. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. In the most literal and terrible way possible, the Marine's consciousness is overwritten by the psychic echo of his Primarch's final moments. He sees what Sanguinius saw. He feels what Sanguinius felt. He relives the terrible duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the desperation and the fury and the agony of being struck down by the brother he once loved. The Blood Angel, caught in the grip of the Black Rage, no longer recognizes his comrades. He no longer understands where he is or when he is. In his eyes, every face becomes the face of Horus. Every battlefield becomes the deck of the Vengeful Spirit. Every enemy becomes a traitor who must be destroyed with every ounce of fury he possesses. There is no cure. There is no recovery. Once a Blood Angel falls to the Black Rage, he is lost forever. His name is struck from the chapter's rolls of honor, and he is inducted into the Death Company, that terrible formation of the damned who are given one final chance to serve their chapter by being hurled into the most dangerous combat zones, where they fight with a ferocity that borders on the supernatural, their enhanced bodies sustained by the psychic energy of their madness long past the point where any rational being would have fallen. They fight until they die, which is usually not long, because that is the only mercy the chapter can offer them. The Death Company is one of the Blood Angel's most closely guarded secrets, yet the Imperium at large knows nothing of it. Other chapters whisper rumors, but the truth is kept hidden behind walls of silence and carefully maintained deception. Because if the Imperium's rulers knew the full extent of the flaw in the Blood Angel's gene seed, the consequences could be catastrophic. Entire chapters have been declared renegade or even destroyed for lesser genetic defects. The Blood Angels endure this knowledge as they endure everything else, with stoicism, with faith, and with the constant, gnawing fear that someday the flaw will consume them entirely. But the Black Rage is only half of the curse. The Red Thirst is its companion, its shadow, its darker twin. Where the Black Rage is a sudden and catastrophic collapse, the Red Thirst is a slow and insidious hunger, a craving for blood that builds over time, be growing stronger with each battle, each kill, each drop of enemy blood that spatters across ceramite armor. Most Blood Angels can control it. They channel it into their fighting, using the hunger as fuel for their fury, without letting it consume them entirely. But control is not cure, and every Blood Angel knows that the Red Thirst is always there, waiting, patient, eternal. Some fall to it gradually, their discipline eroding over decades or centuries of warfare until the hunger becomes too great to resist. Others manage to hold it at bay for their entire service, dying in battle before the thirst can claim them. But none are immune. Not even the chapter's greatest heroes. Not even Commander Dante himself, who has led the Blood Angels for over 1,000 years and is believed to be the oldest living space marine in the Imperium. Yet even he feels the pull of the thirst, the constant battle against his own nature that makes every moment of every day a test of will and faith. This is the legacy that was waiting for the young Lexicanium who would one day become Mephiston. This is the curse that ran through his blood from the moment the gene seed of Sanguinius was implanted in his body and his transformation from mortal human to space marine began. He was one of many, one of thousands who had undergone the process and emerged as a son of the great angel, carrying within him the beauty and the horror that defined his chapter. But he was not like the others, not entirely, because even before his transformation, even before the events that would make him a legend, there was something about the young warrior known as Brother Calistarius that set him apart from his brothers in arms, and that something would prove to be the difference between death and rebirth, between madness and transcendence, between being just another name on the rolls of the Death Company and becoming the most powerful space marine who ever lived. His name was Calistarius, and before he became the Lord of Death, he was a librarian. In the Imperium of man, psykers are both invaluable and deeply feared. They are individuals born with the ability to tap into the immaterium, that roiling dimension of pure psychic energy that exists alongside and beneath the material universe. The warp, as it is commonly known, is the source of all psychic power, but it is also the domain of the chaos gods, as those malevolent entities who feed on the emotions and suffering of mortal beings. To use psychic power is to reach into the warp and draw upon its energies, an act that is roughly equivalent to reaching your hand into a furnace and hoping to pull out warmth without being burned. Space Marine librarians are among the Imperium's most powerful psykers. Selected from among their battle brothers for their psychic potential, they undergo rigorous training and conditioning designed to give them the discipline necessary to wield their abilities without succumbing to the dangers of the warp. They learn to erect mental barriers, to channel psychic energy through carefully practiced techniques, and to recognize and resist the whispered temptations of demonic entities that are constantly probing for weaknesses in their defenses. Among the Blood Angels, the role of the librarian carries additional weight. Because the Blood Angel's gene seed already creates an inherent psychic sensitivity, thanks to the legacy of Sanguinius, their librarians are often more powerful than those of other chapters. But that same sensitivity makes them more vulnerable to the flaw. The Black Rage is, at its core, a psychic phenomenon. The genetic memory of Sanguinius's death is transmitted psychically through the gene seed, and those with greater psychic potential are often more susceptible to its influence. Calistarius was gifted. Even by the standards of Blood Angels librarians, his psychic abilities were exceptional. His mind was sharp and penetrating, capable of feats of precognition and psychic projection that made him a priceless asset on the battlefield. Yet he could sense danger before it materialized. He could project devastating blasts of psychic energy that shattered enemy formations. He could reach into the minds of those around him, reading their intentions and anticipating their actions with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. But his gifts came at a price. Calistarius was isolated from his brothers in ways that went beyond the normal distance between a librarian and his squad mates. He inhabited what might be called a different sphere of existence. The warp was always present at the edges of his perception, a constant background hum of psychic energy that colored everything he saw and felt and experienced. He had faced the horrors of the immaterium. He had wrestled with temptation on a daily basis, pushing back against the whispered promises of demonic entities who sensed his potential and hungered for his soul. As a result, Calistarius found it difficult to relate to his fellow Space Marines with any real empathy. He was not cold or cruel, but there was a detachment to him, a sense of remove that made it hard for others to feel truly comfortable in his presence. He was, in many ways, already apart from his brothers, before fate drove the wedge even deeper. We know that as a young Lexicanium, the lowest rank within the Librarius, Calistarius served with distinction aboard the infamous Space Hulk, known as the Sin of Damnation. In the year 589 of the 41st Millennium, this massive agglomeration of derelict ships dropped out of the warp dangerously close to Baal, the Blood Angel's homeworld. The chapter dispatched Strike Force Raphael to cleanse the Hulk, and Calistarius was assigned as an honorary member of the veteran First Company under Captain Raphael. The fighting aboard the Sin of Damnation was savage and claustrophobic, a nightmare of narrow corridors and sudden ambushes as the Blood Angels battled against a massive Genestealer infestation. The alien creatures were perfectly adapted to the Hulk's labyrinthine interior, emerging from vents and ducts and hidden passages to strike at the Terminators with claws that could shear through the thickest armor. The casualties were heavy. Squad after squad was wiped out in the darkness, their gene seed harvested where possible, their bodies left behind in corridors that had become killing grounds. While Calistarius fought alongside his brothers through kilometers of tangled passageways, his psychic abilities proving invaluable in detecting ambushes and anticipating enemy movements. His precognitive powers warned of threats before they could materialize, and his devastating psychic blasts carved paths through waves of genestealers that might have otherwise overwhelmed the Terminator's defensive positions. The sin of damnation was eventually cleansed, its secrets plundered in the Imperium's name, but the experience left its mark on Calistarius. He had seen the horrors that lurked in the darkness between the stars. He had fought in conditions that tested the limits of even space marine endurance, and he had proven himself a warrior of exceptional skill and psychic potency. But the sin of damnation was only the beginning. The true test of Calistarius' character, the crucible that would forge him into something entirely new, was still years away. It waited for him on a world called Armageddon, in a city called Hades' Hive, beneath tons of rubble and the crushing weight of a madness that had claimed every soul who had ever faced it before. The Second War for Armageddon. Even the name carries weight, a heaviness that speaks to the sheer scale of the conflict that engulfed that industrial world. Armageddon is one of the Imperium's most important hive worlds, a sprawling planet covered in massive industrial complexes and towering hive cities that house billions of human workers in conditions of grinding poverty and ceaseless labor. It is a world that the Imperium cannot afford to lose, and it is a world that has been attacked more than once by enemies who understand its strategic value. The Second War for Armageddon erupted when a massive greenskin force descended upon the planet. This was no mere raiding party or opportunistic warband. This was a full-scale invasion, led by one of the most powerful orc warlords the galaxy had ever seen. The greenskin horde numbered in the millions, a tide of savage warriors and ramshackle war machines that swept across Armageddon's surface like a green flood, overwhelming defenses and crushing everything in its path. The Imperial response was massive. Dozens of Space Marine chapters answered the call, deploying alongside the planet's own Astra Militarum garrison and the steel legions of Armageddon's legendary armored regiments. Among the first to arrive were the Blood Angels, led by Commander Dante himself, bringing their full strength to bear against the greenskin menace. Calistarius deployed with the Blood Angels relief force to Hades' Hive, one of the planet's most important industrial centers. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting, a grinding urban war fought through hab blocks and manufactorums, through underhive tunnels and refinery complexes, through streets choked with rubble and the bodies of the dead. The greenskins fought with their characteristic ferocity, their crude weapons and overwhelming numbers making up for their lack of tactical sophistication with sheer savage determination. It was here, amid the ash and fire of Hades' Hive, that the curse finally found Calistarius. The black rage came upon him like a storm breaking over mountains. One moment he was Brother Calistarius, all librarian of the Blood Angels, fighting alongside his brothers with the discipline and skill that had defined his service. The next moment he was gone, swept away by a tide of psychic fury that crashed through the barriers of his mind like a wave smashing through a seawall. The visions consumed him. The death of Sanguinius, relived in agonizing detail, the face of Horus, twisted with corruption and malice, the terrible final blow that ended the life of the most beautiful being the galaxy had ever known. Calistarius fell to the Black Rage. In the normal course of events, that would have been the end of his story. He would have been inducted into the Death Company, given the black armor that marked the damned, and sent into the most desperate fighting the campaign had to offer, where he would have fought with the inhuman fury of the rage consumed, killing everything in his path until the greenskins finally brought him down. His name would have been added to the rolls of the lost, whispered in the halls of remembrance alongside the thousands of other Blood Angels who had been claimed by the Floor over the centuries. But fate had other plans for Calistarius. After his induction into the Death Company, Calistarius took part in the final assault on an ecclesiarchy building within Hades' Hive. The fighting was savage, as it always was when the Death Company was involved. The rage-maddened Marines threw themselves at the enemy with abandon, their enhanced bodies absorbing punishment that would have killed lesser warriors 10 times over. at their fists and blades carving through green-skinned flesh with a fury that bordered on the demonic. And then the building collapsed. Whether it was enemy fire, structural failure, or simply the accumulated damage of weeks of urban warfare, the result was the same. Thousands of tons of rockcrete and steel came crashing down, burying everything and everyone beneath an avalanche of debris. Marines of the Death Company were crushed where they stood, their enhanced bodies no match for the sheer weight of the falling structure. Greenskins were entombed alongside their enemies, the battle ending not with victory or defeat, but with the simple, implacable physics of a building that could no longer support its own weight. Calistarius was buried alive. And here is where the story becomes something extraordinary, because Calistarius did not die. Crushed beneath the rubble, his body broken and his armor torn and twisted, the fallen librarian clung to life with a tenacity that defied all rational explanation. The black rage still burned within him, the visions of Sanguinius's death still flooding his mind with images of horror and fury. But rather than giving in to the madness, rather than surrendering to the rage and letting it consume the last remnants of his consciousness, Calistarius fought. For 7 days and 7 nights, he lay trapped beneath that rubble. 7 days of screaming and raging against the madness that clawed at his mind. 7 days of wrestling with the psychic echo of his Primarch's death, fighting it with every ounce of willpower and psychic strength he possessed. 7 nights of darkness and pain, and the crushing weight of stone pressing down on his broken body. Think about that for a moment. 7 days, alone in the dark, his body shattered, his mind under siege by a force that had defeated every blood angel who had ever faced it. No food, no water, no companionship, no hope of rescue. Just a man, trapped beneath the weight of a destroyed building, fighting the most powerful psychic compulsion his chapter had ever known. Every other blood angel who had fallen to the Black Rage had succumbed. Every single one. Over 10,000 years of the chapter's existence, the Black Rage had never been defeated. It was considered an absolute, a terminal condition, as inescapable as death itself. The blood angels did not even try to cure it. They simply managed it as best they could, using the Death Company as a final outlet for their afflicted brothers, giving them the chance to die in battle rather than howling in madness in the Tower of the Lost on Baal. But Calistarius did something that no one had ever done before. Through some combination of extraordinary psychic power, inhuman willpower, and perhaps a touch of something that can only be called divine intervention, he fought the Black Rage to a standstill. He pushed back against the visions. He wrestled the madness into submission. He stared into the abyss of 10,000 years of accumulated psychic trauma and refused to blink. And on the 7th night, he won. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. As the Black Rage receded, something else rushed in to fill the void it left behind. Calistarius's gene seed, dormant for years, is suddenly activated with explosive force. Changes swept through his body with the speed and violence of a storm. His muscles swelled with new strength. His bones hardened. His psychic abilities, already formidable, expanded to a degree that was almost incomprehensible. It was as if the act of conquering the Black Rage had unlocked a potential that had been sealed away within his genetic code, waiting for someone strong enough to claim it. The being who heaved aside the massive boulders of his rocky tomb was not Calistarius, not anymore. Calistarius was gone, consumed in the crucible of his 7-day battle with the madness.
Honestly, I have to pause here for a second and just say this from me to you. Mephiston is one of those characters that genuinely gets better the more you dig into him. When I first came into his lore years ago, I thought he was just another overpowered space marine with a cool title, Lord of Death. Sure, sounds awesome on a model box, but the deeper I went, the more I realized that what makes him special is not the power, it is the cost. Every single thing he has gained has come with something taken away. His identity, his humanity, his connections to his brothers, maybe even his soul depending on how you read the Rubicon Primaris scene. And I think that is what separates good 40k characters from great ones. The great ones make you feel the weight of what this universe actually does to people living in it. Mephiston is not just strong, he is tragic, and that tragedy is what keeps me coming back to his story every single time. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
In his place stood something new, something terrible, something that the galaxy had never seen before and would never see again. He was Mephiston, the Lord of Death. And the first thing he did upon emerging from his tomb was kill several dozen orcs with his bare hands. By the time Mephiston clawed his way free of the rubble, the Imperial forces had already retaken Hades' hive from the Greenskins. But the city was still far from pacified. Bands of orcs still roamed the ruins, scavenging for weapons and picking fights with whatever they could find. One such warband happened to be nearby when the sound of scraping stone and grinding rubble announced Mephiston's resurrection. The Greenskins looked at what had emerged from the debris and saw what appeared to be easy prey. A lone space marine, armorless and weaponless, his body bearing the obvious signs of severe trauma. In any other circumstance, their assessment would have been correct. A single unarmed warrior, no matter how enhanced, would have been no match for a warband of several hundred heavily armed greenskins. But this was no ordinary warrior. Mephiston moved with a speed that the orcs simply could not match. His transformed body responded to his commands with a fluidity and power that went far beyond anything he had possessed before the transformation. 5 orcs died in the first 5 seconds, their skulls crushed and their bones shattered by blows of devastating force. A dozen more followed in rapid succession, each kill demonstrating a level of physical prowess that was extraordinary even by Space Marine standards. The Greenskins, to their credit, did not run. Orcs are many things, but cowards is not generally one of them. They pressed the attack with their characteristic stubbornness, at their crude weapons swinging wildly at the blood-slicked figure who was carving through their ranks like a blade through smoke. But nothing they did could slow Mephiston's rampage. Their weapons bounced off his transformed flesh. Their mightiest blows barely registered against his enhanced frame. It was not until Mephiston reached the largest of the orcs that the warband finally broke. The Lord of Death seized the massive greenskin, a towering brute who stood head and shoulders above his fellows, and punched clean through the creature's chest cavity. His fist smashed through muscle and bone and emerged from the orc's back, clutching the still beating heart of its victim. The orc stared down at the hole in its torso with an expression that might have been confusion before it toppled sideways and died. The remaining greenskins fled, and Mephiston, his ruined armor slick with the blood of his enemies, began the long walk back to Imperial lines. The Blood Angels who witnessed his return were stunned. This was a warrior who had been written off as lost, inducted into the Death Company and presumed dead in the building collapse. And yet here he was, alive and somehow transformed, radiating a psychic presence so powerful that even non-psychers could feel it pressing against their consciousness like a physical weight. He was brought before the chapter's chaplains and librarians for examination. They tested him extensively, probing his mind for any trace of corruption or lingering madness, searching for evidence that his apparent recovery was merely a deception by the ruinous powers. What they found was something that none of them had ever encountered before. Yet the black rage was simply gone, not suppressed, not hidden, not lurking beneath the surface waiting for an opportunity to resurface. It had been conquered, defeated, cast out by an act of will so extraordinary that it rewrote the fundamental nature of Calistarius's gene seed. In its place was something else, a psychic potential of staggering magnitude, unleashed by the transformation and growing stronger with each passing day. Mephiston's powers were unlike anything the Blood Angels had seen in a librarian. He was no longer merely gifted. He was something approaching a force of nature, a conduit for psychic energy so vast that the chapter's finest psychers could barely comprehend its scope. He was declared free of corruption. And then something remarkable happened. The newly reborn warrior sought out a suit of armor that reflected his changed nature. Gone was the standard issue blue of the Blood Angels librarium. In its place, Mephiston donned artificer-crafted armor, fashioned in the likeness of exposed muscle, a relic of the chapter's past that had sat unused for centuries, as if waiting for someone to claim it. The armor fit him as though it had been made specifically for his transformed frame, which some of the more superstitious among the chapter took as a sign that his rebirth had been ordained by fate itself. He took up the force sword Vitaris, an ancient weapon of terrible potency. Legend held that Vitaris had been blessed by Sanguinius himself, that the Primarch had touched the blade and anointed it with a drop of his own blood in the distant days of the Great Crusade. In the hands of an ordinary psyker, Vitaris was a formidable weapon, capable of channeling psychic energy into devastating strikes that could cut through virtually any material. In Mephiston's hands, it became something altogether more terrifying. When the Lord of Death called upon his inner fury, the blade burst into crimson flame, burning with the heat of his transformed rage. The very air around it seemed to shiver and distort, as if reality itself was struggling to contain the power that flowed through it. Mephiston rose through the chapter's ranks with a speed that would have been unprecedented even under normal circumstances. His promotion to Chief Librarian, the master of the Blood Angel's entire librarium, came swiftly and without serious opposition. Partly this was due to his extraordinary abilities, which made him the most powerful psyker the chapter had ever produced. But partly it was due to something else, something harder to define. He became one of Chapter Master Dante's closest advisors, a position of enormous influence within the Blood Angel's command structure. Dante, that ancient and weary warrior, who had led the chapter for over a millennium, recognized something in Mephiston that went beyond mere power. He saw in the Lord of Death a reflection of what the Blood Angels might become, a vision of a future in which the flaw might be conquered and the sons of Sanguinius might finally be free of the curse that had haunted them for 10,000 years. But not everyone shared Dante's cautious optimism. Many within the chapter viewed Mephiston with deep suspicion and barely concealed fear. His transformation had been too sudden, and too dramatic, too convenient. The Black Rage did not simply go away. It was an integral part of the Blood Angel's genetic heritage, woven into the very fabric of their gene seed. For someone to simply will it out of existence suggested either a miracle of unprecedented magnitude or something far darker. And there was the matter of his appearance. The transformation had changed Mephiston in ways that went beyond the merely physical. His face, always bearing the family resemblance to Sanguinius that all Blood Angels shared, had become something else entirely. His features were now shadowed by a deathly pallor, his skin taking on a bone-white cast that made him look more like a corpse than a living being. His eyes, once bright and alert, now burned with a transfixing gaze that seemed to reach into the souls of those who met it. A few allies could hold that gaze for long, and even fewer enemies. There was something in those eyes that spoke of vast and terrible knowledge, of powers that operated on scales that ordinary minds could not comprehend. His voice had changed too. Where once Calistarius had been described as good-natured and even jovial, Mephiston was dour and remote. He spoke with an authority that went beyond mere rank, his words carrying a weight that made even veteran captains fall silent and listen. There was no warmth in his speech, no humor, no hint of the man who had once laughed with his brothers and shared stories around the watchfires of distant campaigns. That man was gone, replaced by something harder and colder and immeasurably more dangerous. The whispers followed him wherever he went. Some said he had been touched by Sanguinius himself, or that the spirit of the great angel had reached across 10,000 years of death to lift his chosen son out of the madness and reforge him as a living weapon. Others whispered darker things, that the Black Rage had not truly been defeated, but merely replaced by something worse, that in conquering one curse, Mephiston had invited another into his soul, something that wore the mask of sanity while harboring a darkness that even the Chaos Gods might envy. Few could abide his close company for long. Even his fellow librarians, trained to withstand psychic pressure that would shatter ordinary minds, found Mephiston's presence unsettling. The air around him seemed to hum with barely contained power, a constant low-frequency vibration that set teeth on edge and made the hairs on the back of the neck stand upright. It was like standing next to a reactor that was operating at the very edge of its capacity, knowing that at any moment the containment field might fail and release something devastating. And Mephiston himself seemed to encourage this isolation. Whether by choice or by necessity, the Lord of Death kept his own counsel, sharing his thoughts and plans with no one unless circumstances demanded it. He moved through the chapter like a ghost, appearing when he was needed and vanishing when he was not. His comings and goings tracked only by the residual psychic disturbance his presence left in its wake. This was the being who now held the Blood Angel's Librarius in his iron grip. This was the warrior who stood at Dante's right hand, offering counsel that was as cryptic as it was insightful. This was the Lord of Death, the most powerful psyker in the Adeptus Astartes, the only Blood Angel to have ever conquered the Black Rage. And his story was only just beginning, because the powers that Mephiston had unlocked through his transformation were not static. They continued to grow, expanding in scope and intensity with each passing year. What had begun as an extraordinary enhancement of his existing abilities evolved into something that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible for a Space Marine psyker. His powers reached heights that put him in a category occupied by only a handful of beings in the entire galaxy. He could project his mind into the consciousness of others, not just humans, but even the psychically attuned Eldar, beings whose natural psychic defenses were among the strongest in the galaxy. Thus, where ordinary telepaths might read surface thoughts or plant simple suggestions, Mephiston could drive his psychic presence deep into even the most protected minds, overwhelming their defenses and flooding their consciousness with visions of such intensity that they were driven to the brink of madness. Even elder farseers, those ancient seers who had spent centuries perfecting their mental disciplines, were not immune to his psychic assault. He could split his soul into multiple projections, creating psychic doppelgangers that allowed him to perform multiple feats simultaneously. While one part of his consciousness directed the flow of battle, another could be reaching across vast distances to gather intelligence or coordinate with distant allies. And this ability to exist in multiple psychic states at once was something that had no precedent in the recorded history of the Adeptus Astartes, and it suggested a level of psychic sophistication that was almost inhuman in its complexity. Perhaps most remarkably, and most dangerously, Mephiston demonstrated the ability to manipulate the flow of time itself. He could slow it, stop it, even reverse it within a localized area, bending the fundamental laws of physics to his will through sheer psychic force. But this power came with a terrible caveat. While time was frozen around him, Mephiston himself continued to age normally. If he were to use this ability recklessly, he could potentially exhaust his entire lifespan in a matter of moments, withering and dying while the universe remained locked in temporal stasis. It was a power of extraordinary utility, but equally extraordinary danger, and its existence raised troubling questions about the nature and source of Mephiston's abilities. These were not the powers of an ordinary Space Marine librarian. These were abilities that placed Mephiston among the most powerful psykers in the entire Imperium. Only the Emperor himself, the Demon Primarchs, and perhaps a handful of the most ancient and powerful alien seers could claim to match or exceed his psychic might. It was a level of power that was as terrifying as it was impressive, because power of that magnitude always comes with risks that are proportional to its scope. The question that haunted the Blood Angels, the question that Mephiston himself could not entirely answer, was simple but devastating. Where did all this power come from? If the act of conquering the Black Rage should not have been enough to elevate a talented but ultimately ordinary librarian to such extraordinary heights, the psychic energy required to perform the feats that Mephiston routinely demonstrated was beyond anything that could be explained by simple genetic activation or the unlocking of latent potential. Something else had happened, during those 7 days beneath the rubble of Hades' hive. Something had changed on a fundamental level, altering not just Mephiston's abilities, but the very nature of his connection to the warp. Some theorized that Sanguinius himself had intervened, reaching across death to empower his chosen son with a portion of his own vast psychic might. The Primarch had been an incredibly powerful psyker in his own right. He possessed of precognitive abilities and a psychic presence that could shake the foundations of reality. If even a fraction of that power had been transferred to Mephiston during his transformation, it would explain much about the Lord of Death's extraordinary capabilities. Others suggested a darker explanation. The Black Rage was, at its core, a fragment of Sanguinius's psychic legacy, a piece of the Primarch's soul that had been imprinted into his son's gene seed at the moment of his death. What if conquering the rage had not destroyed this fragment, but absorbed it? What if Mephiston now carried within him a portion of Sanguinius's own psyche, not the sanitized and noble aspects that the chapter celebrated, but the dark and furious essence that had been born in the moment of the angel's death? This theory gained credence through the discovery that Mephiston had indeed absorbed something during his transformation. The warp personification of the Black Rage, an entity known as the Black Angel, a being of pure fury and darkness that represented the shadow side of Sanguinius's soul. This creature, this dark fragment of the Primarch's psyche, now resided within Mephiston, venting its rage through him, feeding his powers even as it threatened to consume him. The implications were staggering. Mephiston was not simply a powerful psyker, he was a vessel for a piece of his Primarch's soul, carrying within him an aspect of Sanguinius that was as ancient and as terrible as the curse itself. He was, in a very real sense, two beings occupying a single body. The man who had once been Calistarius, and the Dark Angel who had been born from the death of a god. It was a burden that would have driven most beings to madness. Indeed, it very nearly did. Because the Black Angel was not a passive passenger, it was a living, conscious entity, constantly pushing against the boundaries of Mephiston's control, seeking to manifest its fury in the physical world. Every battle, every moment of heightened emotion, every use of psychic power created opportunities for the dark entity to surge forward and attempt to overwhelm its host. Mephiston's entire existence became a war on two fronts. On one side, the enemies of the Imperium, the Greenskins and the heretics, and the alien horrors that threatened humanity's survival. On the other, the darkness within, the constant, relentless pressure of a being that wanted nothing more than to be unleashed. And somehow, through some combination of willpower and psychic mastery that defied easy explanation, Mephiston held. Day after day, year after year, century after century, he maintained his grip on the darkness within him and continued to serve his chapter with a dedication that was as absolute as it was costly. This is what makes Mephiston truly extraordinary. Not just his power, which is vast beyond measure. Not just his martial skill, which is among the finest in the Imperium, but his will. That iron, unyielding force of character that allows him to carry a piece of a dead god's fury within his soul and still function as a rational, purposeful being. Every moment of his existence is a battle, and every moment he endures is a victory. The campaigns of Mephiston span centuries of unbroken warfare. How, from the moment of his rebirth in the rubble of Hades' hive, the Lord of Death has been a constant presence on the Imperium's most dangerous battlefields, bringing his staggering psychic might to bear against threats that would have overwhelmed lesser warriors. On the hive world of Holonon, Mephiston led Strikeforce Sanguinatus to exterminate a Genestealer cult that had infiltrated the planetary government. The operation should have been straightforward. Genestealer cults, while dangerous, are typically no match for a dedicated Space Marine strike force, especially one led by a psyker of Mephiston's caliber. But the infestation proved to be merely the advance guard of something far worse. A mighty tendril of Hive Fleet Kraken descended upon Holonon while the Blood Angels, were still prosecuting their campaign against the cult, and turning a routine purge into a desperate fight for survival. Mephiston recognized immediately that his force was outmatched. The Tyrannid swarm was simply too vast, too numerous, too relentlessly aggressive for a single strike force to defeat. He sent a distress call into the void and pulled his warriors into the underhive, using the labyrinthine tunnels and fortified hab blocks as a defensive position from which to mount a fighting retreat. The battles that followed were savage and claustrophobic, the Blood Angels fighting through waves of Tyrannid organisms in conditions that made the Sin of Damnation look spacious by comparison. It was during the desperate defense of the Chapel of the Emperor's Repose that Mephiston demonstrated the full extent of his transformed abilities, single-handedly holding off a massive Tyrannid swarm. Yet the Lord of Death carved a path of destruction through the alien horde that defied belief. He slew the hive tyrant at the heart of the attacking force, a creature of monstrous power whose synapse connection coordinated the actions of thousands of lesser organisms. Its death sent shockwaves through the swarm, throwing the lesser creatures into confusion and buying precious time for the defenders to regroup. But even Mephiston had his limits. A Trigon, one of the massive subterranean burrowing organisms that the Tyrannids used to strike behind enemy lines, caught the Lord of Death in a devastating attack that brought him low. He fell among the wreckage of the chapel, his body broken, but his spirit unbroken, and his sacrifice drove the surviving Blood Angels and Planetary Defense Force troops to new heights of fury. Yet they fought with a desperation born of witnessing their champion fall, holding the line until fresh companies of Blood Angels and Angels Vermilion arrived to break the siege. Mephiston was pulled from the wreckage battered but alive. A force of Eldar from Craftworld Ulthwi fought alongside the Imperial reinforcements, these enigmatic alien warriors remaining just long enough to see the Splinter Fleet eradicated before vanishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. Their intervention raised questions that the Blood Angels were never able to satisfactorily answer. Why had the Eldar intervened? What interest did they have in the survival of a single Space Marine librarian? And what did they know about Mephiston that they were not willing to share? The Archaeo-insurrection was perhaps the most dangerous internal threat that the Blood Angels faced during Mephiston's tenure as chief librarian. It began when a battle brother named Archaeo, corrupted by the insidious machinations of the chaos god Tzeentch, proclaimed himself the reincarnation of Sanguinius. Wielding the sacred chapter relic known as the Spear of Telesto, a weapon that had supposedly been created by the Emperor himself, Archaeo's mutations gave him an appearance uncannily similar to the dead Primarch. Wings grew from his back. His features took on the angelic perfection that was the hallmark of Sanguinius, and his power, enhanced by the dark forces that truly controlled him, was sufficient to convince many Blood Angels that their Primarch had truly returned. The insurrection split the chapter. But Blood Angels, who had served faithfully for centuries, found themselves drawn to Archaeo's banner, desperate to believe that their Gene Father had returned to lead them out of the darkness. It was a crisis that struck at the very heart of Blood Angels' identity, exploiting their deepest hopes and their most profound vulnerabilities. Mephiston led a force from the battle barge Europe to confront the insurrection. He led Brother Sergeant Raphan in facing and killing the now repentant Archaeo, seeing through the deception to the chaos manipulation that lay beneath. But the true architect of the plot revealed himself only after Archaeo's death. Malphalax, a greater demon of Tzeentch, had been the puppet master all along, working in concert with the Word-Bearer's traitor legion to corrupt the Blood Angels from within. And in a moment of devastating irony, Malphalax turned the Blood Angels' own curse against them. The demon unleashed the black rage upon the entire Blood Angels' force, flooding their minds with the psychic trauma of Sanguinius's death in a concentrated blast of malevolent power. Even Mephiston, who had conquered the rage once before, was overcome by the curse. The being who was supposed to be immune to the black rage was consumed by it for the second time. But this time, he was not alone in his struggle. Brother Sergeant Raphan, wielding the Spear of Telesto, used the weapon's power to purge the rage from Mephiston's mind. And Mephiston, freed from the curse for the second time, used his own vast psychic abilities to dispel the black rage from the rest of the Blood Angels, saving the chapter from a mass descent into madness. While it was a feat that should have been impossible, overcoming the black rage once was unprecedented. Overcoming it twice, and then using that experience to free others from its grip, was something that belonged more in the realm of mythology than military history. And yet, Mephiston had done it. He had stared into the abyss for the second time and emerged not just victorious, but stronger, his understanding of the curse deepened by the experience and his ability to combat it enhanced. But the victory came at a cost. Each encounter with the Black Rage left its mark on Mephiston's psyche. Each battle with the darkness within chipped away at the barriers that separated the man from the monster, the Lord of Death from the Black Angel that resided in his soul. How many more times could he face the rage and survive? How many more times could he push back the darkness before it finally overwhelmed him? These were questions that Mephiston kept close, sharing them with no one, not even Dante. He was, as he had always been, alone with his demons. And the demons were growing stronger. The devastation of Baal was the Blood Angel's darkest hour since the death of Sanguinius himself. It was the moment when 10,000 years of sacrifice and suffering came crashing down around them, when the sons of the great angel were pushed to the very brink of extinction by a threat so vast and so merciless that even their legendary resilience seemed insufficient to withstand it. Hive Fleet Leviathan. The name alone carries a weight of horror that is difficult to overstate. The Tyrannid Hive fleets are the greatest existential threat that the galaxy has ever faced. A vast biomechanical swarms of alien organisms that travel between the stars, consuming everything in their path. They strip worlds bare of all biological matter, processing planets into raw biomass that is used to fuel their endless expansion. They have no diplomacy, no culture, no goal beyond consumption. They are hunger given form, and when a hive fleet fixes its attention on a world, the results are usually catastrophic. Leviathan was one of the largest hive fleet tendrils ever encountered by the Imperium, and it was heading directly for Baal. The Blood Angel's homeworld, the sacred ground where Sanguinius had first been found, where the golden sarcophagus containing his preserved body lay in its ancient tomb. Where the chapter's gene seed reserves and training facilities and 10,000 years of accumulated history and tradition were housed within the great fortress monastery of the Arx Angelicum. Commander Dante saw it coming. He had been watching the hive fleet's approach for years, tracking its tendrils as they consumed system after system, each conquest bringing the swarm closer to the Blood Angel's heart. He fortified Baal and its moons like never before, erecting indomitable fortresses above the sweltering sands, laying minefields in orbit, preparing every defense that 10,000 years of military experience could devise. But he knew it would not be enough, not against a fleet of this size, not against a swarm that numbered in the billions. So Dante did something that had not been done since the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. He called the Sanguinary Brotherhood to war. Every chapter that bore the gene seed of Sanguinius, every successor and descendant of the Blood Angels, was summoned to Baal for what might be the final stand of the sons of the great angel. They came. From across the galaxy, they came. The flesh-tearers, savage and barely controlled. The blood drinkers, secretive and grim. The carmine blades, the knights of blood, the angels vermilion, the angels encarmine. Chapters that had not gathered together in millennia answered Dante's call, bringing their strength to bear in a concentration of Sanguinius's bloodline that the galaxy had not seen since the legions marched as one. Nearly 30,000 space marines gathered for the defense of Baal, an army of angels in red armor, preparing for what many believed would be their final battle. Whilst Mephiston was there, of course, but his attention was divided, because even as the Tyrannid fleet bore down on Baal, the Lord of Death was receiving visions. Terrible visions of daemons wreaking havoc across the Blood Angel's homeworld. mountains of skulls filling the landscape. And at the center of it all, a figure that Mephiston recognized with a mixture of fury and dread. Ka'Bandha, the bloodthirster, the ancient demon who had broken Sanguinius's legs at Cygnus Prime 10,000 years ago. The nemesis of the Blood Angels, fighting his way toward a portal that would allow him to breach into the material universe. Mephiston saw the dual threat clearly. The Tyranids were coming from without. Ka'Bandha was coming from within. Either one alone might be enough to destroy the chapter. Together, they would be unstoppable. But the Lord of Death made a decision that would keep him from the main battle entirely. Taking his most trusted disciples, the librarians, Gaius Rassilus and Lucius Antros, along with a cadre of the strongest librarians from each of the assembled chapters, Mephiston journeyed to the Craw Mountains on Baal. There, in caverns filled with psychically resonant crystals, he led a ritual designed to open a portal to Khorne's own realm and destroy Ka'Bandha before the demon could break through into reality. It was audacious to the point of insanity. Opening a portal to the domain of a chaos god was the kind of act that most psychers would consider suicidal. The energies involved were of a magnitude that could burn out even the most powerful mind, and the danger of attracting the attention of Khorne himself was very real and very terrible. But Mephiston had always operated at the edge of what was possible, and he believed that the risk was justified by the threat. The ritual very nearly succeeded. The combined psychic might of the assembled librarians was sufficient to push back against the boundaries between realities, creating a thin point in the veil through which they could strike at the approaching demon. But at the crucial moment, one of the librarians faltered. His faith cracked under the psychic pressure, and the disruption was enough to shatter the delicate balance of the ritual. Ka'Bandha broke through. For one terrible moment, the bloodthirster manifested in the material universe, his enormous form filling the crystal cavern with a presence that was part physical and part metaphysical. Several librarians died instantly, their minds annihilated by the sheer psychic force of the demon's arrival. The cavern collapsed as Ka'Bandha's fury shattered the crystal formations that had been focusing the ritual's energy, burying Mephiston and his surviving companions under tons of rock. It was perhaps a cosmic irony. Once again, Mephiston found himself buried alive beneath the weight of a collapsed structure. Once again, he was cut off from his brothers during a desperate battle. But this time, there was no 7-day ordeal, no battle with the Black Rage, no transformative rebirth. This time, Mephiston and his librarians were simply trapped, forced to blast their way out through solid rock, while the fate of their chapter was decided without them. The battle that raged above them was apocalyptic. The Tyranid fleet descended upon Baal in numbers that defied comprehension, over 50,000 bioships blotting out the stars themselves. 19 waves of merciless attacks smashed against the Imperial defenses, each one larger and more ferocious than the last. 5 chapter masters died in the fighting. 3 of them fell in the terrible battle at the Dome of Angels alone. On Baal Secundus, Gabriel Seth and the Flesh Tearers fought a savage rearguard action against waves of Tyranid organisms that threatened to overwhelm their positions entirely. Commander Dante himself engaged the Swarmlord, the most dangerous of all Tyranid command organisms, in single combat. The ancient chapter master fought with a fury born of over 1,000 years of warfare, and his power axe carving through the Swarmlord's chitinous armor as the alien creature's bone zords sought his hearts. Dante prevailed, slaying the Swarmlord in a duel that will be remembered for as long as the Blood Angels endure. But the victory left him grievously wounded, and the chapter's defensive position was crumbling. And then, at the moment when all seemed lost, 2 things happened in rapid succession that changed everything. First, the Great Rift tore open across the galaxy. The Cicatrix Maledictum, that vast wound in reality that split the Imperium in 2, manifested with a violence that was felt across every system in the galaxy. On Baal, the effects were immediate and devastating. The skies split open, and demons poured through, led by Ka'Bandha himself. the very demon that Mephiston had tried and failed to stop. But Kabanda had not come to destroy the Blood Angels. Not yet. The Bloodthirster had his own agenda, his own twisted sense of ownership over the sons of Sanguinius. None would have the right to destroy the Blood Angels but him, he declared. And so the demons turned their fury not on the defenders, but on the Tyranids, engaging the alien swarm in a battle that was as ferocious as it was unexpected. A mountain of Tyranid skulls, shaped in the 8-pillared symbol of Horn, was left as the only monument to the demons' intervention. Second, the fleet of the Indomitus Crusade arrived in the Baal system. Led by the reborn Primarch Reboot Gilliman himself, the Lord of the Ultramarines and Imperial Regent, the Crusade fleet brought fresh armies and, more importantly, a new generation of warriors, the Primaris Space Marines. Created in secret by Archmagos Belisarius Call over 10,000 years of patient labor, were larger, stronger, and more resilient than their predecessors, and they brought with them weapons and equipment that represented the pinnacle of Imperial technology. Baal was saved. Barely. The cost had been staggering. Entire chapters had been wiped out. Baal and its moons were ravaged almost beyond recognition. The Blood Angels themselves had been reduced to a shadow of their former strength, but they survived. And in the aftermath of the devastation, as the Imperium began the long process of rebuilding, Mephiston made a decision that would transform him yet again. He chose to cross the Rubicon Primaris. The Rubicon Primaris is the name given to the process by which a firstborn space marine, one created using the original gene seed implantation process, is upgraded to a Primaris Marine through the implantation of additional organs and genetic modifications developed by Call. The process is extraordinarily dangerous. The strain of integrating the new implants into an already modified body is immense, and a significant number of those who attempt the crossing do not survive. For Mephiston, the risks were even greater than usual. His body had already been through 2 transformative experiences. His gene seed activated and reactivated in ways that had never been documented before. The integration of Primaris implants into such a system was, to put it mildly, unprecedented. No one, not even the tech priests who would perform the procedure, could predict how his transformed physiology would react to the additional modifications. But Mephiston had reasons beyond personal ambition for attempting the crossing. His powers, vast as they were, had been growing increasingly difficult to control in the years leading up to the devastation of Baal. The Black Angel within him was growing stronger, pressing against the boundaries of his psychic containment with an urgency that suggested the entity was approaching some kind of critical threshold. Mephiston was becoming a danger not just to his enemies, but to his own brothers, his psychic output reaching levels that threatened to overwhelm anyone in his immediate vicinity. The Rubicon Primaris offered a potential solution. The additional genetic modifications might provide the physical and psychic architecture necessary to contain his expanding powers. Or they might kill him, or in the worst-case scenario, and they might release the Black Angel entirely, unleashing a psychic entity of unfathomable destructive potential upon the very chapter it was supposed to serve. Mephiston underwent the procedure anyway, because that is who he is. A being who has never once flinched from a challenge, no matter how terrible the odds or how devastating the potential consequences. The procedure very nearly killed him. As the tech priests worked to integrate the Primaris implants into his transformed body, Mephiston's consciousness was pulled into the warp, not gradually, not gently, but with the violence of a riptide pulling a swimmer beneath the surface. His awareness left his physical form entirely and found itself standing in a realm that existed between realities, at a threshold space where the material and the immaterial blurred together into something that was neither and both. 2 figures waited for him there, the Sanguinor, that mysterious golden warrior who appeared at moments of dire peril to aid the Blood Angels, standing as a beacon of light in the psychic darkness, and the Black Angel, the dark entity that had resided within Mephiston since his first transformation, now manifesting in its true form for the first time. A being of pure rage and shadow, the dark mirror of everything the Sanguinor represented, and between them, a third presence. An echo, a ghost, a remnant of something infinitely greater than either of the entities that flanked it. An avatar of Sanguinius himself, or perhaps something that wore the Primarch's appearance without being the Primarch. In the warp, as such distinctions were often meaningless, the avatar delivered a message that cut to the very heart of Mephiston's existence. He was doomed, it told him, doomed to eventually become the Black Angel, to lose himself entirely to the dark entity that he had carried within him for centuries. This was not a possibility, but a certainty, a fate that was written into the fundamental nature of his transformation and could not be avoided by any conventional means. But there was an alternative. If Mephiston accepted the Black Angel into his body willingly, if he opened himself to the dark entity and allowed it to use him as a prison, the Black Angel could be contained. Its influence over the wider chapter could be weakened, potentially reducing the severity of the Black Rage in future generations of Blood Angels. Thus, it would be a sacrifice of extraordinary magnitude, a willing damnation of his own soul for the benefit of his brothers. The cost would be equally extraordinary. Mephiston would become a pariah, a being so thoroughly intertwined with the dark entity that his very presence would be unsettling to those around him. His soul would be forfeit, consumed by the bargain he had struck. He would become something that was both Mephiston and not Mephiston, a hybrid consciousness occupying a body that served as a prison for one of the most dangerous psychic entities in the Blood Angel's long history. Mephiston accepted. He emerged from the Rubicon Primaris as something entirely new, larger, stronger, and more powerful than he had ever been. His psychic abilities, already among the most formidable in the Imperium, expanded to a degree that was almost incomprehensible. He could see the future with unprecedented clarity. He could control his powers with a precision that had eluded him before the transformation. He could manipulate time itself with a facility that would have been the envy of the most ancient Eldar Farseers. But he was also changed in ways that disturbed those who knew him. When he spoke, his words carried an undertone that suggested more than one voice was speaking. His gaze, already unsettling, now seemed to look through those who met it, as if assessing them on levels that went beyond the merely physical. He described himself in terms that raised more questions than they answered, stating that he both was and was not Mephiston. Astorath the Grim, as the High Chaplain of the Blood Angels and the guardian of the chapter's spiritual purity, argued that Mephiston should be executed. The being that had emerged from the Rubicon Primaris was, in Astorath's judgment, too changed, too compromised, too potentially dangerous to be allowed to continue. Whatever Mephiston had become, it was no longer entirely a son of Sanguinius, and the risks of allowing it to remain within the chapter were too great. But Commander Dante overruled him. The ancient chapter master, who had known Mephiston longer than almost anyone alive, who had relied on the Lord of Death's counsel and combat prowess through centuries of unbroken warfare, made the decision to keep his chief librarian alive. Whether this was an act of faith, a strategic calculation, or simply the decision of an old and weary warrior who could not bring himself to destroy one of his most valuable assets, is a question that only Dante himself could answer. And so Mephiston continued his service, now more powerful and more dangerous than ever before. A Primaris Marine, carrying within him a piece of his Primarch's darkest legacy, serving a chapter that was not entirely sure it could trust him, wielding powers that placed him among the most formidable psychers the galaxy had ever seen. The campaigns that followed Mephiston's Primaris transformation demonstrated the full staggering extent of his enhanced abilities. During the Psychic Awakening, a galaxy-spanning event in which the barriers between the material universe and the warp weakened dramatically, Mephiston used his psychic powers to aid the Blood Angels during the Angels' Halo campaign, his enhanced abilities proving crucial in combating the surge of warp-related threats that accompanied the Awakening. But it was his confrontation with the Thousand Suns that truly showcased the extent of his post-transformation power. drawn by cryptic visions to a war-torn world on the cusp of the Great Rift, Mephiston discovered a cabal of Thousand Sons sorcerers working to unite 9 silver towers in a ritual that would empower their master, the demon Primarch Magnus the Red. The ritual, if completed, would have cast an entire subsector into chaos, creating a permanent bridgehead from which Magnus could project his power directly toward Terra itself. Consider what this means. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, is a demon Primarch, is a being of godlike power who rules an entire planet in the Eye of Terror and commands legions of sorcerers whose collective psychic might is among the most devastating in the galaxy. His champion, the demon prince Zadkiel, was himself a being of extraordinary power, capable of manipulating reality on a scale that would overwhelm most psychers. And Mephiston went after them, not with an army, not with the backing of the entire Blood Angels chapter, but with a small force of his most trusted companions, his librarian disciples, Rassilus and Antros, and whatever Blood Angels he could gather for the mission. The campaign that followed was a battle of psychic might fought across multiple planes of existence. Mephiston matched his enhanced abilities against the collective sorcery of the Thousand Sons, foiling their attempts to complete the ritual through a combination of tactical brilliance, psychic power, and sheer, relentless determination. He infiltrated the planet of the sorcerers itself, the home world of the Thousand Sons in the Eye of Terror, a feat that would be considered suicidal for virtually any other psyker in the Imperium. The fact that he succeeded, that he prevented the summoning of the 9 silver towers, and thwarted the plans of a demon Primarch, speaks to a level of power and capability that exists in a category all its own. This was not a Space Marine fighting Space Marine battles. This was a being of near-transcendent psychic ability, operating on a level that more closely resembled the conflicts between the Primarchs themselves than the engagements of ordinary Astartes. And still, Mephiston endures. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about him. Not his power, which is almost beyond comprehension, not his feats, which read like the exploits of a mythological figure rather than a mortal warrior, but his endurance, his refusal to succumb to the darkness that constantly threatens to consume him from within, his choice, made fresh with every waking moment, to remain Mephiston, to remain a servant of the Emperor and a son of Sanguinius, despite everything that has been done to him and everything that he carries within him. He is a being who has died 3 times and been reborn each time as something more terrible and more powerful than before. First, the death of Calistarius, beneath the rubble of Hades' hive, from which emerged the Lord of Death. Second, the fall to the Black Rage during the Archaeo-insurrection, he from which he was purged by the spear of Telesto. Third, the near death of the Rubicon Primaris, from which emerged something that both is and is not the Mephiston that his brothers knew. Each transformation has taken him further from what he was. Each rebirth has made him more powerful and less human. The gap between Mephiston and his fellow Space Marines grows wider with each passing century. His abilities and his nature increasingly alien to the warriors he is supposed to serve alongside. He is revered and feared in equal measure, a figure of awe and dread whose very presence on the battlefield inspires his allies and terrifies his enemies. But beneath the legend, beneath the title of Lord of Death and the mantle of Chief Librarian, beneath the psychic might and the centuries of warfare, there is still a question that has never been answered. A question that hangs over Mephiston like a shadow, coloring everything he does and everything he is. What exactly did he become? Is he the savior of the Blood Angels, the living proof that the Black Rage can be conquered, the hope of a chapter that has spent 10,000 years in the shadow of a curse that seems insurmountable? Commander Dante believes so. He sees in Mephiston a vision of what the sons of Sanguinius might one day become, free of the flaw, liberated from the genetic prison that has constrained them since the death of their father. Or is he something else entirely? something that wears the shape of a savior while harboring a darkness that is, in its own way, as dangerous as the curse it replaced. The whispers persist, the rumors grow. Even among the Blood Angels, where loyalty to the chapter is absolute and dissent is rare, there are those who look at Mephiston and see not hope, but warning. Not salvation, but a different kind of damnation. Slower perhaps, and more subtle, but no less total. It takes a captured star in the Librarius to contain his power when he lets loose. Think about that. A captured star. The Blood Angels have literally harnessed the energy of a stellar body to serve as a containment vessel for the psychic forces that their chief librarian routinely generates. What kind of being requires that level of containment? What kind of power demands that scale of infrastructure simply to keep it from running out of control? The answer is unsettling, no matter which way you look at it. Either Mephiston is the most powerful loyal space marine who has ever lived, a being whose abilities approach those of the Primarchs themselves, in which case the Imperium is fortunate beyond measure to have him on its side. Or he is something that has moved beyond the category of space marine entirely, a being whose nature is so fundamentally altered by his successive transformations that the title he bears and the rank he holds are merely convenient labels for something that does not fit neatly into any existing classification. Perhaps both answers are true simultaneously. Perhaps that is the essence of Mephiston. He is the space between definitions, the gap between categories, the point where power becomes indistinguishable from peril, where salvation becomes indistinguishable from damnation, where the angel and the monster merge into a single being whose ultimate nature remains, even after centuries of service, fundamentally unknowable. There is something else worth discussing when we talk about Mephiston, and that is the nature of his relationship with the broader hierarchy of the Imperium's psychic landscape. Because when we say that Mephiston is the most powerful space marine psyker, we are making a claim that needs to be measured against some truly formidable competition. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is not short of powerful psykers. From the Grey Knights of Titan, an entire chapter of warrior psykers trained specifically to combat the demonic, to the Thousand Sons, those traitor sorcerers who have spent 10,000 years steeped in the energies of the warp, to the ancient Eldar Farseers whose command of psychic power predates humanity's first steps into the stars. As the competition for the title of most powerful psyker is fierce, and the contenders are legendary. Let us consider some of the names most commonly raised when discussions of psychic power turn to comparison and ranking. Varro Tigurius, Chief Librarian of the Ultramarines, is widely considered the most powerful Space Marine librarian among the standard chapters. His abilities in divination and psychic projection are legendary, and his counsel has guided the Ultramarines through some of their most desperate conflicts. Tigurius is a being of extraordinary psychic talent, and in any other chapter, his abilities would be considered unmatched. But Tigurius, for all his formidable gifts, operates within the normal parameters of what a Space Marine librarian can achieve. His powers are vast, his discipline exemplary, and his contributions to the Ultramarines invaluable. Yet he has never conquered the equivalent of the Black Rage. He has never absorbed a fragment of his Primarch's soul. He has never undergone the kind of successive transformations that have pushed Mephiston beyond the boundaries of conventional psyker classification. Tigurius is the finest example of what a Space Marine librarian can be. Mephiston is an example of what a Space Marine librarian should not be able to become, and yet has. Ezekiel, Grand Master of Librarians for the Dark Angels, is another name frequently mentioned in discussions of Astartes' psychic power. His abilities are formidable, and his role within the secretive Dark Angels hierarchy gives him access to knowledge and resources that most librarians can only dream of. The Dark Angels guard their secrets jealously, and Ezekiel is one of the keepers of those secrets, his psychic abilities shaped and enhanced by millennia of accumulated mystical tradition. Yet even Ezekiel, for all his power and his mysteries, does not approach the heights that Mephiston has reached. The Dark Angel's librarian is a master of his craft, a practitioner of psychic arts that are refined to an exquisite degree. But refinement is not the same as raw power, and in terms of sheer psychic output, Mephiston outstrips Ezekiel by a margin that is difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Njal Stormcaller of the Space Wolves brings a different flavor of psychic ability to the discussion. The rune priests of the Space Wolves do not consider themselves psychers in the traditional sense, in claiming instead that their powers are drawn from the spirit of Fenris itself rather than the warp. Whether this distinction is genuine or merely semantic is a matter of considerable debate among the Imperium scholars of the arcane, but what is not in dispute is Njal's power. He can call down lightning from clear skies, freeze the blood in his enemies' veins, and commune with the spirit beasts of his homeworld in ways that defy conventional understanding. But Njal's power, however impressive, is bound to the traditions and limitations of his chapter's unique approach to the psychic arts. He is a master of a particular school of psychic expression, one that is deeply effective within its own framework, but does not extend to the kinds of reality-bending feats that Mephiston performs routinely, stopping time, projecting his consciousness across the warp, splitting his soul into multiple simultaneous entities. These are not abilities that fit within the Rune Priest's framework of understanding, and they are not abilities that Njal has demonstrated. Among the enemies of the Imperium, the comparison becomes even more stark. Arzek Ahriman, formerly of the Thousand Suns, is perhaps the most famous sorcerer in the galaxy outside of the demon primarchs themselves. His quest to reverse the effects of the rubric that turned his legion into dust-filled automatons has driven him to accumulate psychic knowledge and power on a scale that few can match. Ahriman's rubric was itself a feat of psychic might that affected an entire legion, transforming thousands of space marines simultaneously in a ritual of staggering power. But Ahriman's power comes at a cost that Mephiston has never had to pay. The Thousand Suns sorcerer is a servant of Tzeentch, whether he acknowledges it or not, and his abilities are at least partially derived from his connection to the chaos god of change and sorcery. Mephiston's power, by contrast, is drawn from a fundamentally different source. It comes from the legacy of Sanguinius, from the transformative effects of conquering the Black Rage, from the bargain he struck during the Rubicon Primaris. It is power that is tainted, perhaps, but not corrupted in the same manner. Power that serves the Imperium rather than the dark gods. The comparison that is perhaps most illuminating and most troubling is with the Grey Knights. This chapter, created in the deepest secrecy during the closing days of the Horus Heresy, is composed entirely of psychers. Every single Grey Knight is a trained and disciplined warrior psyker, and their Grand Masters and Prognosticars are among the most powerful psychic beings in the Imperium. Kaldor Drago, the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, is a being of truly extraordinary psychic might, who has survived for over a century within the Chaos Realm itself, slaying demons and defying the Dark Gods in their own domain. And yet even within this context, Mephiston's abilities stand out. The Grey Knights derive their power from their unique gene seed, which incorporates genetic material from the Emperor himself, and from centuries of rigorous psychic training that begins before their transformation into Space Marines and never truly ends. Their power is the product of design and discipline, now carefully cultivated and meticulously maintained. Mephiston's power is something else entirely. It is wild and untamed, born not of careful cultivation, but of catastrophic transformation. It is power that was forged in the crucible of madness and refined by the absorption of a fragment of divinity. It is power that, by rights, should not exist in the form that it takes, and its very existence raises questions about the nature of the Blood Angel's gene seed that the Imperium scholars have never been able to satisfactorily answer. What we can say with confidence is this: among the Space Marines of the Imperium, across all chapters and all traditions, there is no psyker who can match Mephiston's combined psychic, physical, and martial capabilities. Others may surpass him in specific areas. Tigurius may be a more disciplined diviner. Drygo may have endured more extreme conditions. Ahriman may command a broader range of sorcerous knowledge. But in terms of the total package, the raw power combined with the physical enhancement, combined with the martial skill, combined with the sheer indomitable will that holds it all together, Mephiston stands alone. And that brings us to a question that looms larger the more closely we examine it. A question that connects back to the very beginning of our story, to the death of Sanguinius and the curse that followed. Is Mephiston the cure? Commander Dante thinks so, or at least he hopes so. The ancient chapter master has spent over 1,000 years watching his sons fall to the Black Rage, one by one, their names added to the rolls of the lost, their bodies consumed by a madness that offers no cure and no mercy. He has performed the rites of mourning so many times that they have lost their impact, become mere words spoken over empty shells from which every trace of the warrior who once inhabited them has been erased. And then along comes Mephiston, a being who did the impossible, who conquered the unconquerable, who proved, against all evidence and all expectation, that the Black Rage is not an absolute, that the curse of Sanguinius can be fought and, under the right circumstances, defeated. For Dante, Mephiston represents the possibility of a future in which the Blood Angels are free. Free from the flaw that has haunted them for 10,000 years. Free from the constant fear that any moment might be the moment when the rage claims another brother. Free from the terrible secret that they carry. The knowledge that their most glorious warriors might, at any time, be reduced to howling berserkers who cannot distinguish friend from foe. That hope is what keeps Dante from authorizing Mephiston's destruction, even when the evidence suggests that it might be the prudent course of action. Because without that hope, what do the Blood Angels have? Another 10,000 years of slow attrition, watching their best and bravest fall to a curse that no one can stop. Another 10 millennia of performing the rites of mourning and painting the armor black and sending the damned to die in battles that serve as much as executions as military operations. Number Dante will cling to the hope that Mephiston represents, and even if that hope comes wrapped in shadows and whispers and the uneasy feeling that the Lord of Death is not entirely what he appears to be. Because the alternative, a future without hope, is something that even the oldest living space marine in the Imperium cannot bring himself to accept. But others are not so optimistic. Asterath the Grim, whose sacred duty it is to end the suffering of those who fall to the Black Rage, whose axe has cleaved the skulls of more damned Blood Angels than any other weapon in the chapter's arsenal, sees something different when he looks at Mephiston. He sees not a cure, but a complication, not a solution, but a new kind of problem. He sees a being who has exchanged one curse for another, who has pushed back the Black Rage only to invite something equally dark and perhaps more insidious into his soul. And Asterath argued for Mephiston's execution after the Rubicon Primaris, and the fact that Dante overruled him does not mean that the High Chaplain's concerns were unfounded. The being that emerged from the Rubicon Primaris is, by its own admission, both Mephiston and not Mephiston. It carries within it a psychic entity of enormous power and unknowable intention. It operates on levels that even the Blood Angels' most experienced psychers cannot fully understand. And it has demonstrated, on multiple occasions, the capacity to lose control of its powers in ways that endanger everyone in its vicinity. These are not the characteristics of a cure, they are the characteristics of a weapon. And weapons, as any soldier will tell you, are only as reliable as the hand that wields them. The truth, if such a thing exists in the murky waters of Warhammer 40,000 lore, is probably somewhere between the extremes of hope and fear. Mephiston is not the cure for the Black Rage, at least not in the simple sense of a treatment that can be applied to others. His transformation was unique, the product of circumstances so specific and so extreme that they are essentially unrepeatable. No other Blood Angel has ever been trapped beneath the rubble of a collapsed building for 7 days, while simultaneously fighting the Black Rage with the full force of an exceptionally powerful psychic mind. The variables are simply too numerous and too precise to be deliberately recreated. But Mephiston is proof of concept. He is the demonstration that the Black Rage is not truly irresistible, that the curse of Sanguinius can be fought and, as under the right circumstances, defeated. That knowledge alone is invaluable, even if the specific method of Mephiston's victory cannot be replicated. It changes the conversation from one of inevitability to one of possibility. It shifts the paradigm from management to potential cure. And in a chapter that has spent 10,000 years accepting the flaw as an unchangeable fact of their existence, that shift in thinking might prove to be Mephiston's most significant contribution. The bargain he struck during the Rubicon Primaris adds another dimension to this analysis. By accepting the Black Angel into his body, Mephiston potentially weakened the Black Rage across the entire chapter. This suggests that the flaw is not merely a genetic defect but a psychic phenomenon, or one that can be influenced and potentially altered by beings of sufficient psychic power and willingness to sacrifice. If Mephiston's absorption of the Black Angel has genuinely reduced the frequency or severity of the Black Rage in other Blood Angels, then his sacrifice has implications that extend far beyond his own personal story. But at what cost? The damnation of his soul, according to the entity that brokered the bargain. A fundamental alteration of his nature that has made him something that is, by his own admission, not entirely himself. The transformation of the Blood Angel's chief librarian into a being that his own brothers view with a mixture of reverence and dread, a figure of power and mystery who is at once the chapter's greatest asset and its most unsettling presence. As there is a loneliness to Mephiston that is rarely acknowledged in the stories told about him, the lore focuses, understandably, on his power and his victories, on the dramatic moments of transformation and triumph that define his legend. But between those moments, there are centuries of solitary vigil, centuries of carrying the weight of the Black Angel within his soul, feeling it push against the walls of his consciousness, knowing that the day may come when those walls finally give way. Centuries of watching his brothers live and die and fall to the rage, knowing that he alone has found a way to resist it, but unable to share that gift with anyone else. In many ways, Mephiston is the Blood Angel's tragedy distilled into a single individual. He embodies everything that makes the chapter both magnificent and heartbreaking. The beauty and the horror, the grace and the madness, the angel and the monster, locked together in an eternal struggle that neither can win and neither can lose. He is the most powerful space marine in the Imperium, and he is also one of the most alone, a being of transcendent ability trapped in a prison of his own making, carrying a burden that no one else can share and no one fully understands. The weapons he carries are extensions of this duality. Vitaris, the sanguine sword, is a force weapon of extraordinary potency. When Mephiston channels his psychic power through the blade, it ignites with crimson fire, burning with the intensity of the inner fury that he carries always just beneath the surface. The sword is said to have been blessed by Sanguinius himself, touched by the Primarch's hand in the distant days before the heresy. Whether this legend is literally true or merely a poetic interpretation of the weapon's obvious power, it serves as a reminder of the connection between Mephiston and his genetic father. Vitaris is not merely a weapon, it is a symbol of the legacy that Mephiston carries and the price he pays for carrying it. His plasma pistol, an auxiliary weapon that complements the devastating close combat capability of Vitaris, represents the more conventional aspects of Mephiston's martial identity. Even without his psychic powers, even without the supernatural enhancements granted by his successive transformations, Mephiston would be a formidable warrior. He is a space marine of considerable experience, trained in the martial arts of the Blood Angels, honed by centuries of unbroken warfare into a killing instrument of extraordinary precision. The plasma pistol is a reminder that for all his psychic might, Mephiston is still, at his core, a warrior, a soldier, a servant of the Emperor who fights with the weapons available to him, whether those weapons are a force sword, a pistol, or the boundless power of a mind that can reshape reality itself. His artificer armor, crafted in the shape of exposed musculature, is one of the most recognizable pieces of war gear in the Blood Angel's armory. The armor is both practical and symbolic. Practically, it provides protection that meets the exacting standards of Space Marine artificer craftsmanship. Each plate hand-forged and individually fitted to Mephiston's transformed frame. Symbolically, its anatomical design speaks to the duality of Mephiston's existence. He is a being who exists at the intersection of flesh and spirit, of the material and the immaterial. The armor's exposed muscle motif is a visual representation of that intersection, suggesting a being who has been stripped down to his essential nature, with nothing hidden and nothing concealed. The psychic hood incorporated into his armor serves a dual purpose. It amplifies Mephiston's already enormous psychic abilities, providing a framework through which he can channel and direct his power with greater precision. But it also serves as a containment device, a mechanism for regulating the flow of psychic energy that might otherwise overwhelm everything in his vicinity. Without the hood, Mephiston's psychic output would be a constant, uncontrolled flood of warp energy, dangerous to friend and foe alike. With it, he can modulate his power, focusing it into precise applications while keeping the ambient psychic radiation to levels that his brothers can tolerate. The combination of these elements, the sword, the pistol, the armor, the hood, creates a warrior who is as effective at close range as he is at psychic distance. Mephiston is equally devastating in the swirling chaos of melee combat, where Vitaris sings its bloody song, and his enhanced physique allows him to match blows with creatures many times his size, and in the more subtle theater of psychic warfare, where his mind reaches across distances and dimensions to strike at targets that conventional weapons cannot touch. This versatility is one of the key factors in Mephiston's claim to the title of most powerful Space Marine. Other warriors may match or exceed him in specific domains. The Emperor's champion of the Black Templars might be his equal in pure swordsmanship. A librarian of the Grey Knights might rival his psychic discipline. A veteran of the Death Watch might surpass his tactical flexibility. But no single Space Marine combines all of these qualities to the degree that Mephiston does. He is the complete package, the total warrior, the being who can adapt to any threat and respond with whatever combination of physical, psychic, and martial force the situation demands. And yet, for all his power, for all his victories, for all the centuries of service that have made him a legend among the Adeptus Astartes, Mephiston remains an enigma, even to himself. He does not fully understand the source of his power. He does not fully comprehend the nature of the entity he carries within him. But he does not know whether the bargain he struck during the Rubicon Primaris will ultimately save the Blood Angels or doom them. He does not know whether the visions that guide him through the warp are sent by the ghost of Sanguinius or by something that wears the Primarch's face while harboring very different intentions. He knows only that he must endure, that the fight must continue, that the will that carried him through 7 days of madness beneath the rubble of Hades' hive must carry him through whatever lies ahead. Because the alternative, surrender, defeat, the final victory of the darkness within, is something that Mephiston refuses to contemplate. Not because he is not afraid, he is. In the quiet moments between battles, in the solitary hours when the rest of the chapter sleeps and only the Lord of Death remains awake. Staring into the darkness with eyes that burn with psychic fire, Mephiston feels the fear. The fear that his will might not be enough. The fear that the Black Angel is growing stronger while he grows weaker. The fear that the bargain he struck was not a sacrifice, but a surrender, and that the being who will eventually emerge from the wreckage of his psyche will be wearing his face but serving a very different master. But fear has never stopped Mephiston from doing what needs to be done. It did not stop him on Armageddon, when the black rage consumed him and he fought it back with nothing but will and fury. It did not stop him on Holonon, when a tyrannid swarm threatened to overwhelm everything he held dear. It did not stop him during the devastation of Baal, when the entire chapter teetered on the edge of extinction. And it will not stop him now, as the Imperium faces threats from every direction, and the sons of Sanguinius are called once more to stand in the breach between humanity and annihilation. Mephiston will fight, as he has always fought, with every weapon at his disposal, every ounce of power in his transformed body, every last shred of the will that has defined him since the day he clawed his way out of a grave on a world that was drowning in war. Because that is what it means to be the Lord of Death, not the one who brings death, though he does that with terrifying efficiency, but the one who has conquered it, the one who has looked into the abyss that awaits every son of Sanguinius and said, simply and with absolute conviction, no, not me, not today. In the grim darkness of the far future, us where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, Mephiston stands as a monument to what willpower can achieve and a warning about what it can cost. He is the living embodiment of the Blood Angels' deepest hope and their darkest fear, wrapped together in a single towering figure in red armor, wielding a flaming sword and carrying within his soul a fragment of divinity and a shard of damnation. He is the Lord of Death, the chief librarian of the Blood Angels, the only warrior in 10,000 years to conquer the Black Rage, the most powerful space marine in the Imperium of man. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, in the psychic stillness that exists between one battle and the next, Mephiston keeps his vigil. His eyes burn with a light that is neither entirely human nor entirely alien. His mind operates on levels that even his fellow librarians cannot fully comprehend. The Black Angel stirs within him, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment when the Lord of Death's iron will finally falters. That moment has not come yet. And if Mephiston has anything to say about it, if the will that conquered the unconquerable and survived the unsurvivable has any remaining strength, that moment will never come at all. Because that is who Mephiston is. Not a weapon, not a monster, not a saint or a sinner or a savior or a curse. He is will made manifest. The refusal to yield, given form and purpose and power beyond measure. He is every blood angel who has ever fought against the darkness in their blood, and every son of Sanguinius who has ever pushed back against the flaw and chosen to keep fighting despite the certainty that the darkness will win in the end. And then there is the matter of the demon Makar, because this encounter reveals something essential about Mephiston's character that his more spectacular victories sometimes obscure. In the year 977 of the 41st millennium, Mephiston was trapped in the crystal caves of Solon V by this cunning demon. Makar was no mindless beast of the warp. He was a manipulative entity who understood that the greatest weapon against a warrior of Mephiston's caliber was not brute force, but temptation. Physical combat was a language that the Lord of Death spoke fluently, and any demon foolish enough to challenge him on those terms was likely to end up as a dissipating cloud of warp energy. So Makar tried a different approach. He attempted to lure Mephiston to the side of chaos, claiming that the Lord of Death was already firmly on the path to daemonhood. The logic, such as it was, had a cruel and seductive elegance to it. Mephiston's power was drawn from the warp. The entity within him was a creature of psychic darkness. His abilities defied the normal limitations of mortal psychers and approached the territory of the demonic. Was it such a stretch to suggest that Mephiston was, in essence, already a demon in all but name? That the final step into damnation was merely a formality, a ritual acknowledgement of a transformation that had already occurred? It was a temptation that would have given many lesser beings pause. The promise of unshackled power, of freedom from the constant struggle to contain the Black Angel, and of an existence that embraced the darkness rather than fighting it at every turn. Many a warrior, confronted with the evidence of their own corruption and offered a path that led toward acceptance rather than resistance, might have at least considered the offer. might have hesitated, might have asked themselves whether the demon had a point. Mephiston throttled the life out of Makar with his bare hands. He did not engage in philosophical debate. He did not agonize over the demon's words. He did not spend hours or days contemplating the possibility that Makar might be right. He simply reached out, wrapped his hands around the demon's manifested throat, and squeezed until the creature ceased to exist in the material universe. It was a response that was as elegant as it was brutal, as communicating in the simplest possible terms that whatever Mephiston might be, whatever darkness he might carry within him, whatever questions might surround his nature and his destiny, he was not, and would never be, a servant of the ruinous powers. This is a crucial point that often gets lost in the broader discussion of Mephiston's power and mystery. For all the whispers about his nature, for all the legitimate concerns about the entity within him, for all the questions that have never been satisfactorily answered about the source and scope of his abilities, Mephiston has never wavered in his loyalty to the Emperor and his chapter. Not once. Not when demons have offered him power beyond imagining. Not when the black rage has consumed his mind and shattered his identity. As not when the transformation of the Rubicon Primaris presented him with a choice between personal salvation and collective sacrifice. Every time the choice has been presented, every time the temptation has been offered, every time the darkness within has pressed its case for surrender or corruption, Mephiston has chosen the same path, the path of duty, the path of sacrifice, the path that leads not toward personal power, but toward service, not toward damnation, but toward the continued defense of a species that may never fully appreciate the price being paid on its behalf. This consistency of character is, in many ways, more impressive than any of his psychic feats. Powers can be granted by external forces. Victories can be won through luck or circumstance. But moral conviction, maintained through centuries of temptation and suffering, maintained in the face of evidence that might reasonably suggest surrender, is the rational choice, maintained by a being who carries a piece of darkness within his very soul and feels its pressure every waking moment. That is something that comes only from the deepest parts of a warrior's character, and it is something that no amount of psychic power can substitute for or replicate. Now, let us also speak plainly about where Mephiston sits in the broader hierarchy of the Imperium's psychic landscape, because when we say that Mephiston is the most powerful space marine psyker in the galaxy, we are making a claim that needs to be measured against some truly formidable competition. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is not short of powerful psykers. From the Grey Knights of Titan, as an entire chapter of warrior psykers trained specifically to combat the demonic, to the Thousand Suns, those traitor sorcerers who have spent 10,000 years steeped in the energies of the warp, to the ancient elder farseers, whose command of psychic power predates humanity's first faltering steps into the stars. The competition for this title is fierce, and the contenders are legendary. Let us consider the names most commonly raised when discussions of psychic power turn to comparison and ranking. Varro Tugurius, chief librarian of the Ultramarines, is widely considered one of the most powerful space marine librarians among the Loyalist chapters. His abilities in divination and psychic projection are legendary, and his counsel has guided the Ultramarines through some of their most desperate conflicts. He famously communed with the hive mind itself during the Tyrannic Wars, an act of psychic bravery that would have destroyed a lesser mind. Tugurius is a being of extraordinary psychic talent, and in any other conversation, his abilities would be considered unmatched. But Tugurius, for all his formidable gifts, operates within the normal parameters of what a space marine librarian can achieve. His powers are vast, his discipline exemplary, his contributions to the Ultramarines invaluable. Yet he has never conquered the equivalent of the Black Rage. He has never absorbed a fragment of his Primarch's soul. He has never undergone the kind of successive transformations that have pushed Mephiston beyond the boundaries of conventional psyker classification. Tugurius is the finest example of what a space marine librarian can be. Yet Mephiston is an example of what a space marine librarian should not be able to become, and yet somehow has. Ezekiel, Grand Master of Librarians for the Dark Angels, is another name frequently mentioned in discussions of Astarte's psychic power. His abilities are formidable, and his role within the secretive Dark Angels hierarchy gives him access to knowledge and resources that most librarians can only dream of. The Dark Angels guard their secrets more jealously than perhaps any other chapter, and Ezekiel is one of the keepers of those secrets, his psychic abilities shaped and enhanced by millennia of accumulated mystical tradition and forbidden knowledge. Yet even Ezekiel, for all his power and his mysteries, does not approach the heights that Mephiston has reached. The Dark Angel's librarian is a master of his craft, a practitioner of psychic arts that are refined to an exquisite and impressive degree. But refinement is not the same as raw power, and in terms of sheer psychic output and the scope of feats demonstrated in the lore, Mephiston outstrips Ezekiel by a margin that is difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Njal Stormcaller of the Space Wolves brings a different flavor of psychic ability to the discussion entirely. The rune priests of the Space Wolves do not consider themselves psychers in the traditional sense, claiming instead that their powers are drawn from the spirit of Fenris itself rather than the warp. Whether this distinction is genuine or merely semantic is a matter of considerable debate among the Imperium scholars of the arcane. But what is not in dispute is Njal's considerable power, and he can call down lightning from clear skies, freeze the blood in his enemies' veins, and commune with the spirit beasts of his homeworld in ways that defy conventional understanding of the psychic arts. But Njal's power, however impressive, is bound to the traditions and limitations of his chapter's unique approach to the psychic arts. He is a master of a particular school of psychic expression, one that is deeply effective within its own framework, but does not extend to the kinds of reality-bending feats that Mephiston performs on what seems like a routine basis. Stopping time, projecting his consciousness across the immaterium, splitting his soul into multiple simultaneous entities, walking unseen through the domains of chaos itself. These are not abilities that fit within the rune priest's framework of understanding, and they are not abilities that Njal has ever demonstrated. Among the enemies of the Imperium, the comparison becomes even more stark and even more interesting to examine. Arsek Ahriman, formerly chief librarian of the Thousand Suns, is perhaps the most famous sorcerer in the galaxy, outside of the demon primarchs themselves. His quest to reverse the effects of the rubric that turned his legion into dust-filled automatons has driven him to accumulate psychic knowledge and power on a scale that few living beings can match. Ahriman's rubric was itself a feat of psychic might that affected an entire legion, transforming thousands of space marines simultaneously in a ritual of almost incomprehensible power and tragic consequence. But Ahriman's power comes at a cost that Mephiston has never had to pay, at least not in the same fashion, and the Thousand Suns sorcerer is a servant of Tzeentch, whether he acknowledges it or not, and his abilities are at least partially derived from his connection to the chaos god of change and sorcery. He operates with a net beneath him, so to speak, his powers reinforced and sustained by his patron deity's influence. Mephiston's power, by contrast, is drawn from a fundamentally different source. It comes from the legacy of Sanguinius, from the transformative effects of conquering the Black Rage, from the bargain he struck during the Rubicon Primaris. It is power that is complex and perhaps tainted, but not corrupted in the manner of a chaos sorcerer's gifts. Power that serves the Imperium rather than feeding the hunger of thirsting gods. The comparison that is perhaps most illuminating and most troubling is with the Grey Knights. Yet this chapter, created in the deepest secrecy during the closing days of the Horus Heresy, is composed entirely of psychers. Every single Grey Knight is a trained and disciplined warrior psyker, and their Grand Masters and prognosticars are among the most powerful psychic beings that the Imperium has ever produced. Kaldor Drygo, the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, is a being of truly extraordinary psychic might who has survived for over a century within the Chaos realm itself, slaying demons and defying the dark gods in their own domain. His endurance is legendary and his power is undeniable. And yet, even within this elevated context, Mephiston's abilities stand apart. The Grey Knights derive their power from their unique gene seed, which incorporates genetic material from the Emperor himself, and from centuries of rigorous psychic training that begins before their transformation into Space Marines and never truly ends throughout their service. Their power is the product of design and discipline, carefully cultivated and meticulously maintained through traditions that have been perfected over 10,000 years. Mephiston's power is something else entirely. It is wild and untamed at its core, born not of careful cultivation, but of catastrophic transformation. It is power that was forged in the crucible of madness and refined by the absorption of a fragment of divinity itself. It is power that, by rights, should not exist in the form that it takes, and in its very existence raises questions about the nature of the Blood Angel's gene seed and the legacy of Sanguinius that the Imperium scholars have never been able to satisfactorily answer. What we can say with confidence is this: among the Space Marines of the Imperium, across all chapters and all traditions and all philosophies of war and psychic practice, there is no psyker who can match Mephiston's combined psychic, physical, and martial capabilities. Others may surpass him in specific areas. Tigurius may be a more disciplined diviner. Drygo may have endured more extreme psychic environments. Ahriman may command a broader range of sorcerous knowledge. But in terms of the total package, yet the raw psychic power combined with the physical enhancement, combined with the martial skill, combined with the sheer indomitable will that holds it all together, Mephiston stands alone at the summit. The weapons he carries into battle are extensions of this singular nature. Vitaris, the sanguine sword, is a force weapon of extraordinary potency and deep symbolic meaning. When Mephiston channels his psychic power through the blade, it ignites with crimson fire, burning with the intensity of the inner fury that he carries always just beneath the surface of his consciousness. Legend holds that Vitaris was blessed by Sanguinius himself, that the Primarch touched the blade and anointed it with a single drop of his own blood in the distant days before the heresy tore the galaxy apart. And whether this legend is literally true or merely a poetic interpretation of the weapon's obvious power is a question that the Blood Angels themselves seem content to leave unanswered. The ambiguity serves their purpose. Vitaris is not merely a weapon. It is a symbol of the legacy that Mephiston carries and the price he pays for carrying it. And symbols gain their power from mystery as much as from certainty. His artificer armor, crafted in the shape of exposed musculature, is one of the most recognizable pieces of war gear in the entire Blood Angel's armory. The armor is both practical and deeply symbolic. Practically, it provides protection that meets the exacting standards of Space Marine artificer craftsmanship, each plate hand-forged and individually fitted to Mephiston's transformed frame. Symbolically, in its anatomical design speaks to the duality of Mephiston's existence in ways that are immediately apparent to anyone who looks upon him. He is a being who exists at the intersection of flesh and spirit, of the material and the immaterial, of the human and the something more than human. The armor's exposed muscle motif is a visual representation of that intersection, suggesting a being who has been stripped down to his essential nature, with nothing hidden and nothing concealed from the gaze of those who dare to look. The psychic hood incorporated into his armor serves a critical dual purpose. It amplifies Mephiston's already enormous psychic abilities, providing a carefully designed framework through which he can channel and direct his power with greater precision and efficiency. But it also serves as a containment device and a mechanism for regulating the flow of psychic energy that might otherwise overwhelm everything and everyone in his vicinity. It takes a captured star in the Blood Angel's Librarius to contain his power when he truly lets loose. Think about the implications of that for a moment. A captured star. The Blood Angels have literally harnessed the energy of a stellar body and dedicated it to serve as a containment vessel for the psychic forces that their chief librarian routinely generates when he removes his restrictions. What kind of being requires that level of containment? What kind of power demands that scale of infrastructure simply to keep it from running out of control and devastating everything nearby? The answer is unsettling and awe-inspiring in equal measure. Either Mephiston is the most powerful loyal space marine who has ever lived, a being whose abilities approach those of the Primarchs themselves, in which case the Imperium is fortunate beyond measure to have him on its side. Or he is something that has moved beyond the category of space marine entirely, a being whose nature is so fundamentally altered by his successive transformations that the title he bears and the rank he holds are merely convenient labels for something that does not fit neatly into any existing classification within the Imperium's understanding of its own warriors. Perhaps both answers are true simultaneously. Perhaps that is the very essence of who and what Mephiston is. He is the space between definitions, the gap between categories, the point where power becomes indistinguishable from peril, where salvation becomes indistinguishable from damnation, where the angel and the monster merge into a single being whose ultimate nature remains, even after centuries of service and scrutiny, fundamentally unknowable. And that brings us to one final question. The question that underlies everything we have discussed today, every battle and every transformation, every victory and every bargain, every whisper and every fear. Is Mephiston the cure for the Black Rage? Commander Dante believes he might be, or at least he desperately hopes so. The ancient chapter master has spent over 1,000 years watching his sons fall to the floor, one by one, their names added to the rolls of the lost, their bodies consumed by a madness that offers no cure and no mercy. And then along comes Mephiston, a being who did the impossible, who conquered the unconquerable, who proved, against all evidence and all expectation, that the Black Rage is not an absolute, that the curse of Sanguinius can be fought and, under the right circumstances, defeated by sheer force of will. For Dante, Mephiston represents the possibility of a future in which the Blood Angels are free. Free from the flaw that has haunted them for 10,000 years. Free from the constant fear that any moment might be the moment when the rage claims another brother. That hope is what keeps Dante from authorizing Mephiston's destruction, even when the evidence suggests that it might be the prudent course of action. Because without that hope, what do the Blood Angels have? Another 10,000 years of slow attrition, watching their best and bravest fall to a curse that no one can stop. But Astarath the Grim, yet the High Chaplain, whose sacred axe has ended the suffering of countless rage-consumed brothers, sees something different. He sees not a cure, but a complication. Not a solution, but a new kind of problem. A being who has exchanged one curse for another, who has pushed back the Black Rage only to invite something equally dark and perhaps more insidious into his soul. The truth is probably somewhere between these extremes. Mephiston is not the cure in any simple or replicable sense. His transformation was unique, but he is proof of concept. He is the living demonstration that the Black Rage is not truly irresistible. That knowledge alone, that single shift from inevitability to possibility, might prove to be the most important thing Mephiston has ever given his chapter, and the bargain he struck during the Rubicon Primaris, and accepting the Black Angel into his body to weaken the rage across the entire chapter, suggests that the flaw is not merely a genetic defect, but a psychic phenomenon that can be influenced and potentially altered. If his sacrifice has genuinely reduced the severity of the Black Rage in other Blood Angels, then the implications extend far beyond one warrior's personal story. They extend to the very future of the sons of Sanguinius. There is a loneliness to Mephiston that is rarely acknowledged in the stories told about him. Between the dramatic moments of transformation and triumph, there are centuries of solitary vigil, centuries of carrying the weight of the Black Angel within his soul, feeling it push against his consciousness, knowing that the day may come when his walls finally give way. Centuries of watching his brothers live and die and fall to the rage, knowing that he alone has found a way to resist it, but unable to share that gift with anyone else. In many ways, Mephiston is the Blood Angel's entire tragedy distilled into a single individual. He embodies everything that makes the chapter both magnificent and heartbreaking, the beauty and the horror, the grace and the madness, the angel and the monster, locked together in an eternal struggle that neither can win and neither can ever fully lose. Mephiston is what happens when one of those suns decides that the darkness will not win. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And in a galaxy where hope is the rarest commodity of all, that might just be enough. If you have enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Mephiston, the Lord of Death and the most powerful space marine in Warhammer 40,000, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like and every subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to continue bringing you these detailed explorations of the grim darkness of the far future. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more characters to explore, and so many more corners of the Warhammer universe to illuminate together. So until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember that in the darkness of the far future, there are still those who choose to carry the light, even if that light burns with a crimson flame.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.